3 patrol cars parked in front of my house at 6 in the morning, their lights sweeping across my bedroom window like I was the criminal they had been sent to catch. The Homeowners Association president, Vanessa Crowley, stood on the sidewalk beside a locksmith and announced I had 10 minutes to leave what she called community property. I handed over my deed, but she only smiled and said, "Men like me confused stubbornness with ownership." 2 officers checked my paperwork while a third studied the parcel number on my tax bill, frowned, and asked Vanessa a question that made the color drain from her face. Why had this house never been part of the Homeowners Association in the first place? I did not know it yet, but that single question was about to unravel 4 months of lies, forged signatures, and a scheme built entirely on the assumption that a quiet man would never fight back. If you enjoy watching an arrogant Homeowners Association president get crushed by the truth, stick around, because this story earns every second of its ending. I woke to red and blue light bouncing off my ceiling, the kind of light that makes your stomach drop before your brain even understands why. When I walked onto the porch in my bare feet, I counted 3 officers, a locksmith with a rolling toolbox, 2 people wearing lanyards from the management company that ran our Homeowners Association, and a small pickup truck loaded with cardboard boxes and a fresh set of deadbolts. Vanessa Crowley stood in the middle of my front yard as though she already owned the grass under her heels, her blazer pressed, her voice pitched loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear. She announced that the association had completed its recovery process and that I had exactly 10 minutes to gather anything personal before the locks were changed for good. I asked, calmly, whether any of this had come from a judge, because nothing about a lock change at dawn sounded like something a court would authorize on a Tuesday. She looked at me the way you look at a child who has asked an obvious question in the middle of an important meeting, and she said a grown man ought to know when he had already lost. I did not argue with her tone, because arguing with tone gets you nowhere with someone who has decided the argument is already over. Instead, I asked the officers directly whether they were carrying an eviction order signed by a judge, since that is the only kind of order that can legally remove a person from a piece of property they hold title to. Vanessa cut in before anyone could answer, insisting that association paperwork carried the same weight as a court order, which told me everything I needed to know about how she expected this morning to go. It became clear, standing there in the cold with my socks soaking through, that the 3 officers had not been dispatched to enforce a formal eviction at all. They had been sent because Vanessa reported an aggressive squatter blocking the rightful owner from reclaiming her property, a story with just enough urgency in it to get 3 cars rolling before sunrise. The senior officer, a broad-shouldered man named Silas Boone, held up a hand and told everyone to stand still while he reviewed the paperwork Vanessa was holding. That is when I saw it, tucked halfway behind the top page of her folder, a signature with my name on it that I had never in my life put on paper. My chest went tight in a way I recognized from years of walking through half-finished buildings, looking for the one beam that was about to give way. Something in that stack of papers was rotten, and whatever it was, Vanessa had built an entire morning of humiliation on top of it. 4 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible, because the first 2 years I lived in that house were about as quiet as life gets. My name is Nolan Pike. I am 38 years old, and I work as an independent structural inspector, which mostly means people pay me to notice the small cracks before they become expensive ones. I bought an old wood frame house that had been standing since 1951, tucked in the middle of a newer subdivision called Briar Glen, surrounded on every side by matching stucco homes that had been built decades after my own. It was not fancy, but it was solid, and I had put more weekends than I could count into replacing the wiring, resealing the roof, and restoring the porch rail my neighbor said had been there since before the subdivision existed. I liked the way the old floorboards creaked in a pattern I had memorized, the smell of cedar in the hall closet, and the fact that nobody had ever told me what color to paint my own front door, until Vanessa Crowley moved in 3 doors down and decided the whole neighborhood needed fixing. I never went looking for a fight with anyone, least of all a homeowners association I assumed would leave me alone as long as I kept my lawn mowed and my gutters clean. My work kept me busy enough, climbing through crawl spaces and attics across 3 counties, writing up reports on foundation cracks and roof trusses for people who needed an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. That habit of mind, of looking past the surface of a thing to find what was actually holding it up, would end up mattering more than I could have guessed the morning everything started to unravel. Everything changed the week Vanessa announced her signature project, a security gate at the entrance to Briar Glen, complete with a guard booth, a stone sign bearing the neighborhood name, and a dedicated resident lane that would supposedly raise every property value on the street. The architectural plans, which she distributed at a meeting I almost skipped, showed a chunk of that new construction sitting directly on the strip of land in front of my house. She came to my door herself the following week, dressed like she was closing a business deal rather than asking a neighbor for a favor, and offered to buy that strip of land from me for what she called a symbolic price. I turned her down, because that patch of ground carried the water line to my house, the only usable approach to my garage, and an old oak tree the original owner had planted decades before either of us was born. Her expression shifted the moment I said no, and she told me I was standing in the way of the entire community's progress just to protect a house that did not belong in a neighborhood like ours. A week later, the first fine arrived in my mailbox, itemized with a precision that felt less like enforcement and more like a warning shot. The door was painted the wrong shade of white. The truck in my driveway was an unauthorized commercial vehicle. My mailbox did not match the approved association style, and my fence sat 2 inches below the required height. Altogether, the fines totaled $1,850, a number specific enough that I knew someone had spent real time putting it together. I mailed back a copy of my deed along with a short note, explaining that my property had never been part of the homeowners association to begin with. Vanessa did not respond to that point directly, not even once, which in hindsight should have told me she had no answer for it. Instead, a second letter arrived a week later, colder than the first, warning me that failing to understand my obligations did not make those obligations disappear. At the bottom of that letter, almost as an afterthought, sat a membership number and a join date of 2004, a year I can prove I was living in an entirely different state, working my first inspection job for a firm that folded before I ever heard the name Briar Glen. Someone had manufactured a history for me, and they had done it with enough confidence that I understood this was not a clerical accident. It was the opening move in a plan that had already been running for longer than I realized. Once that second letter landed, Vanessa began working the neighborhood the way a lawyer works a jury, one conversation at a time. At association meetings I did not always attend, she described me as an outsider who refused to respect the community, an irresponsible homeowner dragging down everyone else's investment, and a man who seemed determined to make trouble for a board led by a woman. I finally showed up to one of those meetings myself, hoping a calm explanation would settle things before they escalated any further. I told the room I had no objection to the security gate itself, only to the idea of building it on land I actually owned, a distinction that seemed reasonable to everyone except the person running the meeting. Vanessa cut me off before I finished my second sentence. Informing the room, and me, that I was not a lawyer, I fixed houses, and I should stop pretending I understood these documents better than the people who wrote them. It was not just dismissive, it was strategic, because every time she interrupted me, she reminded the room that I was a single man with no standing, someone she assumed she could outtalk, outfine, and eventually outweight. Sitting in my truck afterward, I replayed the meeting in my head, trying to figure out exactly what had just happened, because it had not felt like a policy disagreement at all. It had felt like watching someone build a case against me in real time, brick by brick, using my own silence as the mortar. I was not the kind of person who raised his voice in a room full of strangers, and Vanessa clearly understood that about me before I ever understood it about myself. She had read me the way I read a house, looking for the load-bearing point and pressing on it steadily until something gave way. After the meeting broke up, my neighbor from across the street, an older woman named Marjorie Hale, caught me by the mailbox with a look on her face I had not seen from her before. She told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Vanessa had promised several board members the security gate would be finished before the next association election. If the gate never got built because of a stubborn holdout on the corner lot, Marjorie said, Vanessa stood to lose her seat entirely, and losing that seat apparently was not an option she was willing to consider. Marjorie pulled out her phone and showed me a screenshot of an internal email she had somehow ended up copied on, one where Vanessa wrote that if I would not cooperate voluntarily, the board would create enough financial pressure to force a sale. Reading those words standing in my own driveway changed something in me, because it confirmed this had never been about a fence height or a mailbox style. It was about land, and about a woman who had already decided my house was an obstacle rather than a home. From that night forward, I started keeping every letter, every email, and a written log of every phone call, because I understood I was no longer dealing with a neighborhood dispute. I was dealing with a plan. Not long after that conversation with Marjorie, a new notice appeared taped to my front door, and this one had numbers attached to it that made my stomach turn. The Homeowners Association had recorded a lien against my property for $27,400, a figure supposedly built from 18 months of unpaid dues, late fees, and accumulated interest. I drove straight to the county records office and pulled the filing myself, a document titled Notice of Homeowners Association Lien that claimed I had been a dues-paying member since the very date printed on that second warning letter. Attached to the filing was something called a consent to join agreement, complete with a signature that, on first glance, looked disturbingly close to my own handwriting. It took me only a few seconds to place where that signature had actually come from, because I recognized the exact curve of the letters from a roofing permit I had filed with the city years earlier. Someone had lifted my signature off a public document, pasted it onto a fabricated form, and filed it as though it were an original agreement I had willingly signed. The county archivist who helped me that day, a meticulous woman named Della Quinn, pulled the original 1951 plat and the 2003 subdivision survey without me even having to ask twice. Right there on the survey, printed in plain block letters, was a designation that changed everything I thought I understood about my own house. Excluded Tract A, not subject to Briar Glen covenants, a line drawn decades before Vanessa Crowley ever moved into the neighborhood. Della explained that a property can only join a homeowners association if the owner signs a voluntary agreement, and that agreement gets properly recorded with the county, and there was no such record anywhere in the system for my address. I asked her to pull certified copies of everything, the original plat, the prior owner's deed, my own purchase documents, and the full list of parcels that were actually bound by the association's covenants. Della laid the two documents side by side on the counter for me, the plat and the survey, and traced her finger along the boundary line where my parcel had been carved out of the association's jurisdiction from the very beginning. She told me she had worked in that records office for 19 years and had never once seen a homeowners association attempt to rewrite an exclusion that old without so much as a court filing to back it up. I asked her to walk me through exactly what it would take, legally, for a property like mine to be absorbed into an association after the fact, and she explained that the process required a signed, notarized consent from the owner, a recorded amendment to the covenants, and a formal update to the county's parcel database, none of which existed anywhere in my file. She made copies of everything twice, once for me and once for her own records, telling me quietly that she had seen enough association disputes over the years to know it was worth keeping a second set of eyes on a case like this. With that folder in hand, I mailed Vanessa a formal demand to withdraw the lien within 10 days, laying out exactly why the claim had no legal foundation, citing the exclusion language on the original plat, word for word. Her reply arrived 2 days later, 4 words long, telling me I had already had the chance to settle this quietly, which was not a denial so much as a threat dressed up as regret. 3 days after that exchange, a new notice appeared, this one claiming my house had already been sold internally to the association for a price that matched, almost to the dollar, the fabricated lien amount. Vanessa was telling the neighborhood she had reclaimed a disputed property, and in her retelling, my house had somehow become both a burden and a prize at the same time. When I dug into the paperwork behind that so-called sale, I found nothing that resembled an actual legal transfer. There was no lawsuit filed anywhere in the county system, no public notice of any foreclosure auction, no order signed by a judge, and no deed transfer recorded in the property database. There was no sheriff's certification, which any lawful foreclosure sale would require, and the only buyer listed anywhere in the paperwork was the homeowners association itself. What Vanessa had actually done was hold a closed-door meeting with 2 board members and later described that private gathering to the neighborhood as a public auction. There was no public notice posted anywhere, no listing filed with the county clerk, and no opportunity for any outside buyer to even learn the sale was supposedly taking place. Audrey Knox later told me that a real foreclosure sale involves weeks of published notice, specifically so that no single party can quietly declare it's the winning bidder behind closed doors. Vanessa had skipped every one of those steps and simply written the outcome she wanted onto association letterhead, banking on the assumption that nobody would ever check. She sent an email to residents announcing that the association had, in her words, reclaimed control of a controversial property, and she added, almost casually, that the house would likely be demolished to make room for the new security gate. Reading that line, I understood she was not simply trying to take my land anymore. She was trying to erase the house entirely, and with it, any evidence that the land had ever belonged to anyone but her association. I called a real estate litigation attorney named Audrey Knox that same afternoon, and within an hour she confirmed what I already suspected, that no homeowners association anywhere has the legal authority to seize a property this way. She warned me, though, that Vanessa might try to provoke a physical confrontation, hoping I would react in anger and hand her a story that painted me as the dangerous one. Audrey gave me a short list of instructions and made me repeat them back to her before she hung up the phone. Never put my hands on anyone from the association. Never say anything that could be twisted into a threat, and record every single interaction on video from the moment it began. Keep the original deed locked away somewhere safe. Hand only certified copies to police officers if they showed up, and call her the instant Vanessa appeared with a locksmith in tow. I installed 2 more cameras on the outside of my house that same week, one aimed at the driveway and one covering the front porch. But otherwise, I kept living my ordinary life, waking early, driving to job sites, and refusing to give Vanessa the satisfaction of watching me panic. Audrey called twice more that week just to check on how I was holding up, which struck me as unusual for a lawyer who was technically only handling my paperwork. She told me she had seen cases like this before, where a person with real authority in a small community decided the rules simply did not apply to them, and that the ones who eventually lost always underestimated how much a quiet, organized opponent could accomplish. I did not feel particularly organized most nights, sitting at my kitchen table sorting through folders of letters and printouts until well past midnight, but I kept at it anyway, because the alternative was letting Vanessa write the only version of the story anyone would ever hear. The night before everything came to a head, Marjorie called to warn me that Vanessa had hired a locksmith and told the board that police would, in her exact words, escort the squatter off the property. I thanked Marjorie, checked that my cameras were recording, and tried to sleep, though sleep did not come easily that night. At exactly 5:52 the next morning, my driveway camera caught Vanessa stepping out of her car and personally hammering a sign into my front lawn that read "Property of the Homeowners Association." Her posture rigid, her jaw set like a woman certain she was about to win. Which brings the story back to where it began, standing on my porch in bare socks while Vanessa told 3 police officers that I was a former tenant who had lost all rights to remain on the property. She claimed, with a straight face, that I could become dangerous if provoked, a line clearly designed to put the officers on edge before I had even said a word. I walked out slowly and set everything I had on the porch railing where everyone could see it: my driver's license, my property tax statement, a certified copy of my deed, the original survey with excluded Tract A printed across it, and a letter from Audrey Knox summarizing the entire dispute in plain language. Officer Tessa Monroe, the youngest of the 3, asked Vanessa directly whether she had an eviction order from a court, and Vanessa produced a document titled Certificate of Homeowners Association Possession instead. Deputy Aaron Finch took the certificate and turned it over in his hands, and I watched his expression change as he searched, unsuccessfully, for a court case number anywhere on the page. There was no judge's name printed anywhere on that document, no official court seal pressed into the paper, and nothing but 2 signatures, Vanessa's and the property manager's, sitting alone at the bottom. Finch looked up and explained, in a voice that carried more patience than Vanessa deserved, that police officers cannot force a resident out of a home based on an internal association decision alone. Vanessa's composure cracked for the first time that morning, and she insisted she had already spoken with dispatch and been assured that officers would, in her phrase, handle the rest. She glanced at the locksmith and told him to keep setting up, as though sheer momentum might carry the morning forward regardless of what the paperwork actually said. The locksmith hesitated, looking between Vanessa and the 3 officers, clearly unwilling to touch my front door until someone in a uniform told him it was lawful to do so. Monroe stepped between him and the porch steps, telling him plainly that no locks were being changed on this property until the ownership question was settled, and he set his toolbox back down on the grass without another word. I pulled up the footage on my phone and played it for everyone standing there, showing Vanessa hammering a sign into my yard with her own hands and directing the locksmith toward my front door before a single officer had even arrived. She did not back down easily, and instead, she turned the insult up another notch, telling the officers that I was taking advantage of everyone's patience, and that men like me only stepped back once someone stronger showed up to force the issue. Officer Boone said nothing in response to that comment, but I noticed he was no longer looking at Vanessa at all. He had gone quiet in the particular way careful people go quiet right before they ask the question that changes everything, his eyes moving back and forth between 2 sheets of paper as though he were double-checking a number he did not want to be wrong about. He was comparing the parcel number printed on her certificate against the parcel number printed on my own tax bill, and the 2 numbers did not match. I had seen that same look on my own face 100 times, standing in someone's attic with a flashlight, staring at a beam that did not sit quite right, knowing the rest of the inspection was about to change because of it. Boone pulled up the county's parcel mapping system on the laptop mounted inside his patrol car, scrolling slowly while everyone else on the lawn fell quiet around him. He found my address on the digital map, zoomed in until the boundary lines were sharp, and then he asked Vanessa the question that had been waiting 4 months to be asked out loud. Why did this property never appear anywhere in the original declaration that established the Homeowners Association in the first place? Vanessa answered fast, too fast, calling it nothing more than an old administrative error that had never been corrected. Boone pointed to the words on the screen, excluded Tract A, and asked what document, if any, had ever brought that parcel into the association after the subdivision was originally recorded in 2003. Vanessa handed him the consent form instead, the same one bearing my forged signature, as though producing it faster might make it more believable. I explained calmly that the signature had been copied from a roofing permit I filed years earlier, that the date on the form predated the year I actually purchased the house, that the mailing address listed used a zip code that had been retired long before, and that the notary stamp on the page belonged to someone whose license had already expired on the date the form claimed to have been signed. Officer Monroe switched on her body camera and asked Vanessa to explain the discrepancies one by one, and something in Vanessa's composure finally gave way under the weight of that simple request. In the space of a single frustrated breath, Vanessa said it never should have been excluded in the first place, that she was only correcting a mistake the original developer had left behind. Boone repeated her words back to her slowly, asking whether she was admitting that she had personally altered a legal property record. Vanessa immediately tried to walk it back, insisting the management company handled all the paperwork, but the locksmith had already lowered his toolbox to the grass and was backing toward his truck. The two association staff members retreated a few steps further, putting visible distance between themselves and the woman who had brought them there. Deputy Finch called dispatch to review the original report Vanessa had filed that morning, and the transcript came back with 3 claims, all now clearly false. That I was occupying the house without any legal right, that the Homeowners Association possessed a valid legal order to remove me, and that I had threatened staff members sent to take possession of the property. My driveway footage, time-stamped and unedited, contradicted every single one of those claims in under 30 seconds of playback. Officer Boone asked Vanessa to hand over her phone and the folder of documents she had brought with her, explaining that the morning now involved possible forged records and a false report made to law enforcement. Audrey Knox arrived a few minutes later, having driven straight over the moment I called her, and after reviewing everything on the porch, she asked the officers to file a formal report documenting each piece of paperwork Vanessa had presented. The officers did not arrest her on the spot, since they still needed to trace the documents back to their origin, but they made it unmistakably clear that she needed to leave my property immediately. Vanessa tried to hold on to whatever dignity she had left, telling me flatly that this was not over, as she turned to walk back toward her car. I told her that for my house, it very much was, and I meant every word of it. Over the following days, Della Quinn dug back through the county archive and found the complete paper trail that finally explained everything. The original owner, a man named Walter Keene, had refused to enroll his property in the Homeowners Association back in 2003, when the developer first laid out the subdivision plans around his existing home. The developer accepted that refusal and simply built the new neighborhood in a ring around Walter's lot, which is exactly why my house sits surrounded by newer homes that all belong to an association mine was never legally part of. The narrow strip of land Vanessa wanted so badly belonged entirely to my parcel. With the association, holding only a limited easement for maintaining an underground water line that ran along its edge. That easement, Della explained, gave the association permission to access the pipe for repairs, and nothing more, certainly not the right to erect a permanent gate, a guard booth, or a stone entrance sign. Della told me she had also found a short letter Walter Keene wrote to the original developer back in 2003, explaining in his own words why he wanted no part of the new association being formed around him. He had written that he intended to leave the property to his family exactly as he had bought it, free and clear of dues, votes, and committees, and that he expected the boundary to be honored for as long as the house stood. Reading his letter felt strange, like hearing from someone who had fought a smaller, quieter version of the same battle decades before I ever moved in. Marjorie handed over screenshots of several more internal emails to both the attorney and the responding officers, including one where Vanessa wrote plainly that once the lien was recorded, I would not have the financial resources left to fight back. A financial review the board later requested revealed that Vanessa had spent more than $38,000 from the association's reserve fund on management company fees, the locksmith, a falsified survey, forged enrollment paperwork, and marketing materials for a gate project the full board had never properly approved. The accountant hired to conduct that review told the board she had rarely seen spending authorized so casually, with invoices approved by a single signature instead of the two required under the association's own bylaws. Several of those invoices were dated weeks before the board had even voted on a preliminary budget for the gate project, which meant Vanessa had been spending money on a plan that technically did not yet exist. When asked to explain the discrepancy, the property manager who had processed the payments said only that Vanessa had told her the paperwork would catch up once the project was finished, a phrase that stuck with me long after I first heard it. The following week, the association called an emergency meeting, and true to her nature, Vanessa still showed up expecting to control the room. She took her usual seat at the head of the table and opened by claiming she was the real victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by a bitter, unhappy man. She painted me, once again, as someone who cared nothing for community safety, who resented a woman holding real authority, who was actively harming everyone's property values, and who was hiding behind what she called a minor paperwork technicality. I did not bother arguing about character, because character was never the actual issue on the table that night. Instead, I laid out the evidence piece by piece: the original plat, my deed, my tax records, the county's refusal record from 2003, the forged consent form, the timeline proving the signature had been lifted from an unrelated permit, Vanessa's own internal emails, the police incident report, and video recorded from 2 separate cameras that morning. Boone's written statement was read aloud to the room as well, confirming plainly that no court order had ever existed and that officers had responded to information later proven false. Marjorie stood up in front of the entire room and repeated, word for word, something Vanessa had said to her privately months earlier, that a man living alone would never be able to stand against an entire community. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence at the start of the meeting, heavier and clearly no longer on Vanessa's side. One board member, a retired school teacher who had served alongside Vanessa for 3 straight terms, asked to see the forged consent form for herself, holding it up to the light as though a second look might somehow change what it said. Another resident, a man who had voted for Vanessa in every election since the association's founding, admitted out loud that he had personally seen her direct the survey crew to mark the boundary line differently than what the county map actually showed. Nobody in that room was defending her by the time the discussion wound down. Not even the 2 people who had shown up beside her 4 months earlier, ready to help carry boxes out of my house. When the board finally called a vote on her removal, The result was close to unanimous, with only one hand staying down. Vanessa was stripped of her position as president, cut off from every association account she had controlled, ordered to surrender her laptop and remaining files, and escorted out of the building by the board's own attorney before the meeting even adjourned. As she reached the door, I told her that losing her seat that night was only the very first consequence heading her way, and from the look on her face, I think she finally understood I was right. In the weeks that followed, investigators confirmed a long list of violations tied directly back to Vanessa, filing a false police report, submitting forged legal documents, improperly recording a lien against property she had no rightful claim to, misusing association funds without proper board approval, and attempting to seize control of real estate the association had never legally owned. There was no need for a long, dramatic courtroom battle to close out the story, because the consequences arrived clearly enough on their own. The fraudulent lien was fully removed from the county records within days, and the association sent a public letter to every resident confirming, in writing, that my house had never once been a member of Briar Glen's Homeowners Association. Vanessa was ordered to personally repay a portion of the funds she had misused from the reserve account, and the association's insurance carrier refused outright to cover any of her intentional misconduct. The newly elected board filed its own civil action to recover the remaining missing funds, while the district attorney's office opened a separate investigation into the forged documents and the false report made to police. The management company that had quietly helped produce Vanessa's paperwork was dropped from its contract with Briar Glen within the month. I never asked for revenge against the entire neighborhood because most of the people living there had no idea what Vanessa had actually been doing behind closed doors. What I did ask for was simple and specific: that the association stop using my name and my address in any future paperwork, that no staff member ever step onto my land again without my direct permission, that every forged document tied to my property be formally withdrawn from the record, that the association cover the legal fees I had been forced to spend defending myself, and that the new board adopt a transparent process for any future dealings involving individual homeowners. The Security Gate project collapsed entirely since there was no longer any legal path to build it on land the association had never owned in the first place. Looking back, Vanessa brought 3 patrol cars to my front lawn hoping to remove me from my own home before breakfast, and in the end, the only thing that actually got removed from Briar Glen was her. A few months later, Briar Glen had a new board in place, and the atmosphere around the neighborhood settled into something closer to ordinary. The newly elected president came to my door without a lawyer, a fine, or a locksmith trailing behind her, and she apologized in plain, simple terms before asking whether I would consider signing a proper legal agreement allowing continued access to the water line running along the edge of my property. She told me the new board had spent their first 2 meetings simply reading through everything Vanessa had left behind, and that the further they dug, the more grateful they became that I had kept such careful records of my own. I appreciated the honesty, and I told her so, because it was the first conversation I had with anyone from that association in months that did not feel like the opening move of another fight. I agreed, but only on my own terms. Any future access would require advance notice. No permanent structure could ever be built on my land. The agreement would never make me a member of the association, and no clause in it could be altered without my personal signature attached. I repaired the old fence along the front of the property and mounted a small sign near the gate that read, in plain lettering, "Private property, not part of Briar Glen Homeowners Association." One morning not long after that, Officer Boone drove past on his usual patrol route and slowed to a stop when he noticed the new sign. He rolled down his window, glanced at the lettering, and told me he figured nobody would be making that particular mistake again. I told him the sign was less about warning anyone off and more about making sure the truth was the first thing people saw when they walked up the driveway, and he nodded like a man who understood exactly what I meant. I thought back, standing there in the morning light, to the version of myself who had stood on that same porch in wet socks, watching a woman with a folder full of lies decide my entire future for me before I had even had coffee. It would have been easy, in that moment, to raise my voice, to grab the sign out of the ground myself, to give Vanessa exactly the reaction she seemed to be hoping for. Instead, I had done the only thing I actually knew how to do well, which was to look past the surface of the story everyone else believed and find the one detail holding the whole thing up. I looked past him at my old house, still standing exactly where it always had, surrounded on every side by newer homes that all matched one another, and none of them matched mine. Vanessa once believed that 3 patrol cars parked outside my house would be enough to turn her version of events into the truth. But ownership was never going to belong to whoever spoke the loudest that morning. It belonged to the person holding real paperwork and to the patience it takes to make everyone else actually stop and read it. Marjorie waved from her porch across the street as Boone's patrol car pulled away, and I waved back, thinking about how close an entire neighborhood had come to believing a lie simply because it was delivered with enough confidence. That morning, I was never truly removed from my home at all. The only thing that ended up permanently excluded from Briar Glen was Vanessa Crowley's grip on power.